They thought one kick could erase him. One cruel moment, in front of the entire city's elite, would be enough to bury a son for daring to live honestly. But what Richard Carter never understood was that his violence would not erase Ethan Carter. It would ignite him. The ballroom of the Carter real estate headquarters glowed with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. Guests in tailored suits raised glasses of champagne, celebrating the company's newest multi-million-dollar contract. On the grand stage stood Ethan Carter, 22 years old, his dark hair neatly combed, his posture steady though his heart raced. He had worked hard to support the team's architectural design, and this was his chance to thank the people who believed in him. Ethan adjusted the microphone, his voice calm yet warm as he began to speak. "I want to thank everyone who trusted in this vision. This company was built on more than profit. It was built on creating spaces where people can feel at home." The audience nodded, a polite wave of applause rising. For a moment, Ethan felt the weight of belonging, of finally being seen not just as the son of Richard Carter, but as someone with ideas worth listening to. But then, from the side of the stage, footsteps echoed. Richard Carter, the man everyone in the room admired as the formidable CEO, stepped forward. His sharp suit reflected authority, his jaw tight with disdain. He placed a hand on the microphone stand, cutting off his son's words with a chilling pause. His voice carried like a knife. "Enough, Ethan. You have no place speaking for this family, for this company." The ballroom grew silent. Even the hum of glasses stilled in midair. Richard's eyes narrowed, his tone laced with venom. "You are the shame of this family. My shame. A son who flaunts being gay in front of the world. You think this company was built for you." His words cracked the air, each syllable heavy, deliberate, meant to crush. Ethan's breath caught. The hundreds of faces before him blurred into one frozen mural of fear, shock, and silent compliance. He opened his mouth, but before any defense could form, Richard's leg moved swiftly. The heel of a polished shoe slammed into Ethan's chest. The crowd gasped as the young man fell backwards, his body striking the stage floor with a thud that echoed beneath the chandeliers. Phones lifted discreetly. Guests captured the moment but lowered their eyes, afraid to intervene. Richard Carter stood tall above his son, unchallenged, as if the violence was another speech. Ethan lay on the floor, pain radiating through his ribs. But it was the humiliation that seared deeper. A father's rejection, not whispered behind closed doors, but broadcast in front of hundreds who chose silence over justice. The cameras continued to roll. Though no one spoke, the images would later move beyond that ballroom. But in that moment, Ethan's world shrank into a sharp, unbearable truth. His father did not simply disown him. He had tried to erase him with one single act of brutality. Yet even in pain, Ethan's eyes, wet and burning, refused to close. He realized that this wound was not just a scar for him to carry. It was a beginning, a blueprint, one that Richard Carter, in his arrogance, had just drawn for his own downfall. Because what Richard saw as weakness, the world would one day recognize as resilience. Ethan's silence on that floor was not surrender. It was the quiet before the storm. And this story, his story, was only just beginning. So if you're listening now, stay with Hard Stories. Because what follows is not just about betrayal, it's about the strength it takes to rise from the ground, to face the man who tried to bury you, and to show the world that family is not defined by cruelty, but by the courage to live your truth. In the end, the lesson whispered through that ballroom was clear. Blood may bind, but love and dignity are chosen. And when they are stolen, standing up for yourself is the only way to take them back. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled the hospital room where Ethan Carter lay motionless, his chest wrapped in bandages. The lights above him hummed, cold and indifferent, as monitors traced the fragile rhythm of his recovery. His body had absorbed the force of his father's attack, but it was the silence after the silence of every guest who looked away that left a wound deeper than fractured ribs. The doctors spoke of rest and healing, but there was no prescription for humiliation. Every time Ethan closed his eyes, He saw the chandeliers, the frozen stairs, the heel of a polished shoe striking down, not just flesh, but dignity. He had dreamed of building homes, spaces filled with light and belonging. Yet the man who raised him had turned his own body into a weapon to cast him out. Beside his bed sat Laura Carter, a woman who had spent years living beneath Richard's shadow. Her once vivid spirit had dimmed under his control, but tonight her hands trembled not with fear, but with anger. She had watched silently for too long, through business dinners where Richard spoke over her, through boardrooms where her ideas were dismissed, through years where her son's laughter was muted because he had been taught his truth was shame. Now she leaned forward, her voice quiet yet firm. Not for the room, but for her son. She revealed what Ethan had never been told. The towering company that bore the Carter name had not been built by Richard alone. The seed capital, the first property deeds, the foundation that allowed Carter Real Estate to grow into an empire, all of it came from the inheritance of Laura's parents. It had been entrusted for Ethan, their only grandson, with Richard granted temporary authority only until Ethan came of age. The revelation struck like lightning. The betrayal was no longer just personal, but deliberate. Richard had not only rejected his son as family, he had tried to erase the rightful heir, to bury legal truth beneath dominance and fear. The kick in front of hundreds had not been an impulsive act of rage. It had been a calculated move to brand Ethan unworthy in the eyes of others, to weaken him before he could claim what was his. Ethan's breath shuddered as the truth settled into the marrow of his bones. His pain was no longer just about bruises. It was the realization that his father's violence was tied to greed, to the desire to silence him before he could stand as an equal. In that sterile hospital room, under fluorescent light, he saw with clarity Richard Carter was not protecting a legacy. He was stealing it. Laura's hand rested on her son's arm, her eyes carrying years of regret. She admitted that fear had chained her voice, fear of losing status, of breaking apart a household, of being crushed under Richard's power. But as she looked at her son, broken yet unbent, she understood that silence was no longer survival. It was complicity. Ethan, though weakened, felt resolve rise in his chest stronger than the ache of any fracture. He had been denied acceptance as a son, denied truth as an heir, denied dignity as a man who dared to live openly. Yet he refused to be erased. He whispered only to himself, but the words pressed into the air like stone. He would not let this be the end. This was not a story of defeat, but of beginning. If his father believed humiliation would break him, then the greatest defiance would be standing again, stronger, carrying the very truth Richard had tried to bury. In that quiet room, a vow took shape. He would rise not only for himself, but for every young person who had been told their existence was shame, for every child silenced by a parent's control, for every voice dimmed by fear. The lesson did not arrive in thunder or applause. It arrived in stillness, that truth can be buried, but never destroyed. And when courage finally breathes life into it, truth has the power to dismantle empires built on lies. When the bruises began to fade and the fractures knit themselves slowly back together, Ethan Carter stepped out of the hospital into a city that felt both familiar and strange. His body had healed enough to walk without help, but something inside him had shifted forever. He carried not only the memory of humiliation, but the knowledge that his father's violence was tied to a deeper betrayal. That truth now burned like a steady flame, guiding each step. The world outside did not yet know what had happened behind the polished doors of the Carter celebration. Clips had begun to leak online. Whispers on social media about the CEO who struck his own son. But whispers alone would never be enough. Ethan understood that survival was not the end. He needed to fight, and for that fight, he needed proof. In the weeks that followed, his days blurred into long hours of searching. He visited county offices, requested dusty archives, flipped through contracts stamped with his grandfather's signature. He uncovered bank statements opened in his name when he was still a boy, forgotten accounts that carried the mark of inheritance. He pieced together the story that Richard had buried beneath charm and intimidation. Every file, every paper trail, every signature was a brick in the case he would build. Yet documents alone would not be enough to stand against Richard Carter, a man who commanded lawyers and influence like weapons. Ethan turned to someone who knew both him and the law, his closest friend from college, now an attorney with a sharp mind and an unwavering sense of justice, agreed to help. Together they sat across cluttered desks, maps of the company's structures spread out before them, crafting arguments that were more than legal strategy. They were lifelines, a blueprint for reclaiming what was stolen. At night, when exhaustion pressed heavy, Ethan found a different source of strength. He began to reach out beyond the circle of courts and contracts, to the community that had once made him feel less alone. The local LGBT center opened its doors not with pity, but with solidarity. Activists, journalists, and young people who had endured rejection saw in Ethan's story a reflection of their own. They encouraged him to speak, to write, to let the truth breathe beyond private battles. Slowly, the narrative began to shift. Where Richard had tried to frame him as weak, Ethan became a symbol of quiet resilience. Articles spoke of the heir who had been cast aside for living authentically, of the empire that might not belong to the man who claimed it. For the first time, the silence that had weighed on Ethan began to break. His voice was no longer only his own. Meanwhile, Richard Carter continued as though nothing had changed. In his arrogance, he dismissed the gathering storm. He laughed at the notion of being challenged by his own son, certain that power and reputation would shield him. But arrogance blinds. It kept him from noticing the cracks forming at the edges of his empire, the evidence piling piece by piece into the hands of the very person he had tried to erase. Ethan did not rush. He built carefully, methodically, each step taken with the precision of an architect who knew the structure had to be strong enough to stand against earthquakes. He knew that once the case was filed, there would be no turning back. This was not just about property or money. It was about dignity, about proving that no parent, no figure of power, had the right to strip away truth through force. On the evening when the last document was signed and the complaint prepared, Ethan looked at the stack of papers that held years of silence transformed into testimony. It was heavy not with weight, but with meaning. He realized then that justice is never gifted. It is built, brick by brick, often from the very ruins left behind by betrayal. And in that quiet recognition lay a lesson: the wounds others inflict may scar, but they can also shape resolve. When you choose to confront injustice rather than bury it, the very pain meant to silence you becomes the foundation on which you rise. The courthouse in downtown stood tall against the morning light, its columns carved in stone, its steps worn by decades of people searching for justice. On that day, it became the stage where a son would confront the father who had tried to erase him. Inside, the air carried the tense weight of anticipation. Reporters filled the benches, cameras pointed toward the double doors, while whispers rippled through the crowd about the scandal that had broken the image of Richard Carter, once praised as a model CEO. When the gavel struck, silence fell. At the front sat Richard, his suit immaculate, his expression rehearsed into calm authority. He denied everything. He called the claims exaggerated, the accusations baseless. He spoke of loyalty to his company, of sacrifice, of a reputation earned over decades. His voice had the polish of a man used to winning every argument, every deal. He insisted that Carter Real Estate was his creation alone, that no one, least of all his son, had the right to challenge it. Ethan Carter sat across from him, not as the boy who had once been humiliated on a ballroom floor, but as a man who had come armed with truth. He let his attorney lead the arguments, carefully unveiling the pieces of evidence he had gathered. One by one, the puzzle formed a picture that could not be ignored. First came the will of his grandparents, documents stamped and notarized, stating clearly that the inheritance was left for Ethan. Then came the records of bank accounts and shareholder agreements, each bearing Ethan's name from the earliest years of his life. But it was not paper alone that swayed the room. The projector flickered, and onto the wall appeared the video from that night. The ballroom gleamed under chandeliers, the crowd frozen, and in the center, Richard's leg lashed out, striking Ethan with force. The sound echoed through the courtroom as if happening again. The gasp of the guests replaying in collective memory. Faces in the gallery turned pale. The myth of Richard Carter, the visionary, the patriarch, the untouchable executive shattered in seconds. The judge's gaze hardened. Questions cut through Richard's defense, and his polished replies began to fray. Each denial rang hollow against the evidence. Each attempt to shift blame collapsed under the weight of what everyone could see with their own eyes. The courtroom was no longer a sanctuary for his authority. It had become a mirror, showing him as he truly was. Ethan did not gloat. He sat steady, shoulders squared, his eyes forward. This was not victory born of vengeance. It was survival transfigured into justice. When the judge's ruling came, the words were clear. Ethan was the rightful heir. The company, by law and by legacy, belonged to him. Richard was ordered to step down. A murmur spread through the room, growing into a wave of astonishment. Reporters scribbled, cameras clicked, and beyond those walls the story would spread across the city and further still. Yet Ethan did not hear the noise as triumph. For him, it was something quieter. The sound of a weight lifted, of a truth acknowledged that had long been buried beneath fear. As Richard slumped back, stripped of the control he had wielded for years, Ethan felt no need for a final word. The verdict itself was enough. It was not the roar of a crowd that marked this turning point, but the stillness of knowing he had reclaimed the voice stolen from him. The lesson of that day was etched deeper than any legal decree. Power may silence truth for a time, but it cannot erase it. Evidence endures, integrity endures, and when they finally surface, they dismantle even the strongest illusions. The mansion that once stood as a symbol of Richard Carter's triumph had grown silent. Its marble halls no longer echoed with the sound of business meetings or laughter from curated gatherings. Curtains stayed drawn, the fountain outside ran dry, and the phone lines carried only silence. Richard lived there now like a ghost haunting his own empire, abandoned by partners who once praised him, deserted by friends who once clung to his power. The empire he had built on control and intimidation had collapsed in less than a season. While Richard faded into solitude, Ethan Carter stepped into a new role not with fanfare but with steady resolve. As the official heir and new face of Carter Real Estate, he chose not to simply inherit but to transform. Boardrooms that had once been exclusive now echoed with different voices: young professionals, community leaders, advocates for affordable housing. Ethan pushed projects that prioritize fairness, developing spaces for first-time buyers, investing in neighborhoods long ignored by the pursuit of profit. The company shifted from a fortress of wealth into something closer to what he had dreamed: a foundation where people could belong. Beside him stood Laura Carter, who had spent years muted by fear but now found her voice again. When she signed her name alongside her sons on the restructuring documents, it was more than business. It was a declaration that silence would no longer be their legacy. For the first time in decades, mother and son moved as partners, choosing honesty over fear, transparency over control. What Richard had sought to keep only for himself had become something larger, something that carried both family memory and the promise of renewal. Ethan often worked late into the night, overseeing projects, reviewing blueprints, speaking with teams. Yet he never forgot the night he had been kicked to the ground, the moment when his own father tried to bury him beneath shame. He carried that memory not as bitterness, but as fuel. Standing on the balcony of the company's headquarters after a long day, he looked out at the city skyline washed clean by rain. Lights shimmered across the streets, reflections glinting like stars on glass. He whispered words meant not for the crowd, but for himself. He tried to bury me, but I was the seed. The sentence did not carry triumph. It carried survival, growth. The reminder that what had been intended as an ending had become the soil for a new beginning. And with that came a quiet truth. Bloodlines may tie people together, but love, respect, and courage are what make family real. When those are absent, the strongest choice one can make is to stand, to live authentically, and to rebuild from the fragments left behind. Ethan had lost a father in that ballroom, but in rising he had gained something greater, the dignity of living without compromise, and the chance to give others what he himself had been denied a place to belong. So the question remains for all who hear his story, when those meant to protect you choose instead to cast you aside. Will you let their rejection define you, or will you rise, like Ethan, and turn their attempt to bury you into the roots of your own strength? This has been his story, and there are more like it waiting to be told. Stay with Heart Stories, where voices once silenced find the power to speak again.